Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about the HOA that claimed that I did not own my property. I live in a quiet neighborhood where disputes rarely go beyond whose turn it is to mow the shared pathway. But a few weeks ago, I opened a letter that threatened to turn my peaceful life upside down. The letter was from the Homeowners Association, telling me that my barn, a sturdy old structure that had stood on my land since before I was born, might not actually be mine. The letter claimed that according to revised property records, my neighbor Owen, 45, and his wife Tess, 43, were the rightful owners of the barn and the small patch of land around it. They were demanding that I voluntarily sign over ownership, or they would take the matter to court. I sat there rereading the letter, trying to make sense of it. My grandfather built that barn with his own hands. It wasn't just a building. It was a piece of my family's history. Owen and Tess had always been pleasant enough, but now they were saying this was some kind of long-standing mistake. The HOA, of course, sided with them, encouraging me to avoid unnecessary conflict. But I knew this wasn't about a mistake. It was about greed, and I wasn't about to give up without a fight. As I set the letter down, anger boiled inside me. Owen and Tess were acting like they were doing me a favor, as though I should feel lucky they weren't suing me outright. Something didn't sit right. How could a property that had been in my family for decades suddenly belong to someone else? The next morning, I drove to the county records office. The clerk, Janine, was polite but busy, tapping away at her keyboard as I explained the situation. "That's odd," she said, pulling up the files. "The original deed is here, but there's an amendment dated about 6 months ago." "What kind of amendment?" I asked, leaning over the counter. She flipped the monitor around, showing me a scanned document. It was a simple form, transferring ownership of the barn and surrounding land to Owen. My signature, or rather a terrible forgery of it, was right there at the bottom. I felt my pulse quicken. "This is fake," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Janine frowned. "If you're sure, you might want to consult a lawyer, and I'd file a fraud report with the county office immediately." Leaving the building, I knew one thing for certain. Owen and Tess had fabricated this entire story. I couldn't prove it yet, but the timing of that amendment was too convenient. Owen had always been interested in the barn, dropping hints about wanting to buy it for extra storage space. I'd turned him down every time. That evening, I called Maggie, a lawyer a friend had recommended. She was younger than I expected, 28, but sharp and confident. "Property disputes can get messy," she said, flipping through the photos of the fake amendment I had sent her. "But if this is a forgery, it's a criminal act. You need to prepare for a fight." Maggie's first advice was simple: don't agree to anything. The next day, she filed a formal complaint on my behalf and requested a court order to preserve all records related to the barn. Meanwhile, I filed a fraud report with the county and started combing through every piece of paperwork I had. Owen and Tess didn't waste time. A few days later, I received notice that they had filed a lawsuit, claiming the barn was theirs and demanding immediate transfer. They framed it as a clerical correction and accused me of refusing to acknowledge the truth. But this wasn't just about winning or losing a barn, it was about exposing the lies. When the lawsuit officially landed in my hands, it felt surreal. Owen and Tess accused me of being unreasonable, calling my refusal to hand over the barn obstruction of justice. Justice? There was nothing just about trying to steal property through lies. Maggie was unfazed. "Let them dig their hole," she said, sipping her coffee as we prepared my response. "The more they push, the more mistakes they'll make." The first hearing was scheduled for a month later, giving us just enough time to gather evidence. Maggie submitted my family's original deed, old property tax records, and photographs of the barn, some dating back decades. It painted a clear picture. The barn had always been part of my land. Meanwhile, Owen and Tess's case relied entirely on the fraudulent amendment. Their lawyer, a slick man named Ryan, argued that the document was legitimate, describing the supposed clerical error as an unfortunate oversight corrected in good faith. I could see Tess in the courtroom, her face a mask of innocence, nodding along to every word. The courtroom itself was small but intimidating. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, opened proceedings by asking both parties to state their claims. Maggie, calm and methodical, presented my evidence first. She explained the barn's historical significance, our family's uninterrupted use, and the suspicious timing of the amendment. Then came Owen's turn. He and Tess sat at their table, spinning a story about how they had discovered the mistake during a review of their property line. They claimed they were only pursuing this for fairness. Under cross-examination, Maggie started to poke holes in their story. "Owen, can you explain why you never mentioned this supposed mistake until now?" Owen hesitated. "We didn't notice it until recently." "And yet," Maggie continued, holding up a series of emails we had obtained during discovery, "you reached out to Eli several times over the past year trying to purchase the barn. Isn't that correct?" His face reddened. I was just making an offer. "And isn't it true that when Eli declined, you began contacting the HOA about property boundaries?" Tess shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and the courtroom buzzed. Maggie wasn't done. She called Janine from the county records office as a witness. Janine testified about the suspicious amendment, confirming it had been filed under Owen's name with a signature that didn't match my handwriting. By the end of the day, Maggie had painted a clear picture. Owen and Tess had manufactured this clerical error to take what wasn't theirs. But what happened next turned the tide completely. During discovery, Maggie had requested HOA communications related to the dispute. Hidden among routine emails was a thread between Owen, Tess, and Larry, the HOA president. The messages revealed their plan. Owen had promised Larry free repairs on his property in exchange for support in the barn dispute. Larry assured Owen he'd convince me to settle, even offering to back the fake documents if the case went to court. Maggie introduced these emails during the second hearing, and the courtroom erupted. The judge immediately called for a recess, ordering an independent investigation into the HOA's practices. Owen and Tess's lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear. Tess shot Owen a furious look, while Larry, seated in the gallery, suddenly looked pale. By the time the hearing ended, it was clear that the tide had turned in my favor. When we reconvened, the air in the courtroom felt heavier. The emails Maggie had uncovered were like a bombshell, exposing a scheme that reached far beyond just Owen and Tess. The judge ordered Larry, the HOA president, to testify. His reluctant shuffle to the witness stand said it all. He wasn't ready for what Maggie had prepared. Maggie wasted no time. "Larry, as HOA president, are you aware of the organization's responsibility to act impartially in disputes between members?" Larry nodded, his voice low. "Yes. And yet," Maggie continued, holding up the printed email thread, "you coordinated directly with Owen and Tess to pressure my client into relinquishing his property. Is that correct?" Larry squirmed. "I wouldn't put it that way. How would you put it then?" Maggie's tone sharpened. "Because this email clearly states you advised them to pursue the amendment process, despite knowing the barn had belonged to Eli's family for decades," Larry stammered, trying to explain it away as a misunderstanding. But the damage was done. The judge interrupted, her voice cold. "Mr. Larry, I suggest you answer directly. Your actions as HOA president will be subject to further scrutiny, and any attempt to mislead this court will only make things worse for you." Larry finally admitted to his involvement, though he tried to downplay it. He claimed he had only acted in the best interests of the community. But when Maggie presented more emails revealing he had personally benefited, Owen and Tess had promised him free renovations and lawn services, his defense fell apart. The court proceedings shifted focus, with the judge now scrutinizing the HOA's practices. Other residents, inspired by what was unfolding, came forward with grievances of their own. Stories about shady fines, manipulated votes, and Larry favoring certain neighbors bubbled to the surface. Owen and Tess sat silently through this chaos, their earlier confidence completely gone. Tess kept glancing at Larry as if silently blaming him for their predicament. Owen, meanwhile, looked like he wanted to be anywhere but there. By the end of the day, the judge ordered an independent audit of the HOA's dealings. "This court has no tolerance for organizations abusing their power," she declared. Larry was forced to step down as president immediately, pending further investigation. For Owen and Tess, this revelation only deepened the hole they dug for themselves. Their fraudulent claim on the barn now looked like just one piece of a much larger pattern of deceit. I could feel the weight shifting in my favor. Maggie leaned over during a break and whispered, "We've got them." The final day of the trial arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Owen and Tess sat stiffly at their table, whispering to each other but avoiding eye contact with anyone. Larry was nowhere to be seen, likely scrambling to deal with the fallout of his exposed misconduct. Maggie sat beside me, calm and confident, her notes meticulously organized. The judge opened the session with a stern reminder. This court is not just about resolving property disputes, but ensuring justice is served. I have reviewed all the evidence, and today, I will render my decision. Maggie began with her closing arguments, presenting the narrative we had carefully constructed over the past few weeks. She highlighted the barn's clear ownership history, the fraudulent amendment, and the blatant collusion between Owen, Tess, and Larry. Owen and Tess attempted to manipulate the legal system for personal gain, using forged documents and corrupt practices to strip my client of his rightful property, she said. Her words carried weight, each one hitting like a hammer. When Ryan, their lawyer, stood to make his case, his argument felt weak in comparison. He claimed that Owen and Tess acted in good faith, insisting they were simply following advice from the HOA. But the judge wasn't buying it. She interrupted him mid-sentence. "Mr. Ryan, the emails provided to this court show clear intent to deceive. Are you seriously suggesting your clients didn't understand the implications of their actions?" Ryan stammered, glancing back at Owen and Tess, who looked like they wanted to sink into the floor. Finally, it was time for the judge to deliver her verdict. She didn't mince words. "The evidence presented overwhelmingly supports the plaintiff's case. The barn and the surrounding land have belonged to Mr. Eli's family for decades, and the attempted amendment was nothing more than a fraudulent scheme. This court rules in favor of the plaintiff. Mr. Eli will retain full ownership of the barn and property. Furthermore, Owen and Tess are ordered to pay damages to cover legal fees, emotional distress, and punitive charges for their fraudulent behavior." The courtroom buzzed as she continued, turning her attention to the HOA. "As for the Homeowners Association, this court will recommend a full investigation into its practices. Abuse of power and collusion have no place in any community organization." Owen's face was beet red and Tess sat frozen, her mouth slightly open as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Maggie gave me a subtle nod, and I felt an immense wave of relief. But I wasn't done yet. The court ruling was just the beginning of my revenge. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt a mixture of relief and determination. Winning the case had been a major victory, but Owen, Tess, and Larry had caused me months of stress and financial strain. They had tried to take what was mine through lies and deceit, and they weren't going to walk away unscathed. First, I took immediate action against the HOA. With the court's recommendation, I filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office, detailing their corrupt practices. I wasn't the only one. Several neighbors, emboldened by the trial, came forward with their own stories of unfair treatment by Larry and the HOA board. Together, we demanded a full audit of the HOA's finances and operations. The investigation moved quickly, and the results were damning. Larry had been siphoning funds from the HOA account for years, using them for personal projects while ignoring legitimate neighborhood needs. The state dissolved the current HOA structure and appointed a neutral administrator to oversee its reorganization. Larry faced criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. Owen and Tess didn't escape either. After losing the case, they were hit hard by the court-ordered damages. Maggie had ensured we demanded not only compensation for legal fees, but punitive damages that left a noticeable dent in their finances. Their house, once the pride of the neighborhood, was put up for sale within weeks, but I wasn't done. With the barn officially and publicly declared mine, I decided to turn it into something that would cement its legacy. Instead of using it for storage, I transformed it into a community hub, a place for gatherings, workshops, and small events. I invited the neighbors who had supported me through the ordeal, offering free use of the space. The grand opening was a celebration of resilience and unity, a statement that greed and corruption had no place in our community. As for Owen and Tess, their social standing plummeted. Neighbors who had once chatted with them at block parties now crossed the street to avoid them. Tess tried to act as though nothing had happened, but the cold shoulders and whispered conversations were impossible to ignore. Eventually, they packed up and left the neighborhood for good, their reputation in tatters. Larry faced even harsher consequences. His trial for fraud made local headlines, and his guilty plea meant jail time. I heard he tried to make amends, but his days of wielding power in the neighborhood were over. For me, the experience was a hard lesson in standing up for what's right. Revenge wasn't just about getting even. It was about ensuring that those who wronged me couldn't harm anyone else. The barn, once a quiet family treasure, had become a symbol of justice, resilience, and community. In the weeks that followed, life in the neighborhood began to return to normal, or at least a better version of it. Without Larry's grip on the HOA, residents started to rebuild trust in one another. The newly appointed administrator ensured transparency, and for the first time in years, people felt like their voices mattered. The barn stood at the center of this change, Its transformation into a community hub became a rallying point for neighbors. It hosted everything from kids' art workshops to movie nights, bringing together people who had been divided by the HOA's toxic politics. I made a point to keep the space open to everyone. Everyone except Owen and Tess. They had sold their house at a loss and disappeared, leaving behind little more than sour memories. I overheard someone at a local diner mention they had moved to a neighboring town, but they weren't missed here. Larry, on the other hand, wasn't just a memory. His sentencing came quickly after he pleaded guilty to charges of fraud and embezzlement. Seeing his smug confidence reduced to regret was a moment I wouldn't forget. The judge's words during sentencing echoed in my mind. When you abuse trust, you destroy community, and you'll face the consequences. As for me, I found peace in moving forward. The barn, once a source of stress and conflict, now stood as a reminder of my family's legacy and the importance of fighting for what's right. I'd learned the value of persistence, the strength of community, and most importantly, the power of justice. One evening, as the sun set behind the barn, casting long shadows over the freshly painted walls, I stood there reflecting. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a testament to what could be achieved when you stand firm, even when the odds seem stacked against you. Revenge had been sweet, yes, but this sense of closure and community was far sweeter. Life had returned to normal, or so I thought. The barn thrived as a community hub, and I was finally able to enjoy some peace. But one evening, as I was locking up after a small event, I noticed something strange. The back door of the barn, which I rarely used, was ajar. I walked over thinking maybe one of the kids had forgotten to close it. But as I pulled the door shut, I noticed something scratched into the wood near the frame. You might have won, but you don't know the whole story. My first thought was that it was a leftover taunt from Owen or Tess, but something about it felt off. The carving was fresh, and they'd been long gone. Whoever had done this wanted me to see it now. The next day, I installed security cameras around the barn. If someone was planning more trouble, I wasn't about to let them get away with it. Maggie was skeptical when I told her. "It's probably just someone trying to mess with you," she said. "People like Owen and Tess leave ripples, but they don't usually come back." That reassurance lasted until I reviewed the footage from the first night. Around 2 a.m., a figure approached the barn, hooded and wearing gloves. They didn't try to break in, but they walked the perimeter, pausing in front of the camera for just a moment. Their face was obscured, but they raised a hand to wave before walking off into the dark. I called the police, but without more evidence, there wasn't much they could do. "Probably just a prank," the officer said, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than that. Then the letters started. Short, cryptic messages slipped under my door. "They lied to you too. Look deeper. The barn holds secrets." At first I thought it was nonsense, but one of the notes included something that stopped me cold. An old photo of the barn, dated decades before my grandfather built it. In the background was a figure I didn't recognize, standing near the same patch of land that had been the center of the lawsuit. Confused, I went back to the county records office. Janine, the clerk who had helped me before, was just as baffled. "This is strange," she said, holding the photo up to the light. "The barn wasn't even recorded as part of your family's property until the 1940s, but this picture looks older than that." We dug deeper and found something buried in the archives, a deed predating my family's ownership, listing the land and the barn as part of another property entirely. The name on the deed? A man named Thomas, Owen's great-grandfather. The revelation hit me like a punch. Could there have been some truth to Owen's claim after all? Was this why they had been so desperate to take the barn? But then Maggie found the final piece of the puzzle, a series of land transactions from the 1930s, showing that Thomas had sold the property under duress during the Great Depression. The sale had been legal but contested, leaving behind decades of resentment in Owen's family. The barn had become a symbol of that old grudge, a grudge Owen and Tess had tried to settle in their favor. The pieces fell into place, and suddenly the cryptic notes made sense. Someone from Owen's family, or someone connected to them, was still trying to settle a score. That night, as I stood in the barn, I felt the weight of its history. It wasn't just a structure. It was a battleground for a conflict that had started long before I was born. But it was also mine now, legally and rightfully, and I wasn't about to let anyone take it from me. The cameras stayed up, the barn stayed locked, and as the mysterious notes stopped and the neighborhood grew quieter, I realized something. Sometimes, winning isn't the end of the story, it's just the beginning of another, and this time I was ready. Friends, thank you. See you soon.